Every 11 seconds, there's a new ransomware attack. Oil pipelines, universities, corporations, all paying millions of dollars. Barracuda says, don't pay the ransom. Before a ransomware attack occurs, train your teams to recognize an attack and use anti-phishing technology. Protect your applications, and they can't get onto your network. Simple backup and restore solutions quickly recover your data without paying the ransom. Build your ransomware protection plan now by visiting securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. Welcome back to Paul's Security Weekly. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. You can subscribe to all of our shows on the Security Weekly network by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe. All of our podcast feeds are there. All new episodes downloaded right to your device. You can join our mailing list, Discord server, follow us on all of our social media and streaming platforms, all on securityweekly.com/subscribe. Don't forget to join our next webcast on November 4th. to learn about pragmatic steps to reduce your software supply chain risk with the fine folks at GitLab. On November 11th, learn the key insights and takeaways from the 2021 OWASP Top 10 with Contrast Security featuring Jeff Williams. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to save your seat. Visit, the on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. If you want to protect your secrets and your passwords, we did a great one with Keeper. I was actually really impressed with their technology. Make sure you go check that one out. And now, on to the news articles for this week. Where do we want to start?
It's a great question.
We think we need to agree on this before we start the segment, like where we want to actually start, because we tend to spend the first few
I know
minutes.
which one. I want to hit Lee's number one.
Lee's number one. Viewing a website, HTML code is not illegal or hacking, according to a professor that has told the Missouri governor this, which we all pretty much said, which I think is a pretty safe bet.
The reason I posted this is because when we talked about this, what was it, a week or two ago? We're like, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. We all know that looking at the source code of a web page is not a freaking criminal act. Somebody tell that governor. And here this guy freaking did it, okay? I know that sounds a little silly, but I'm like, yeah, hello. It's like, what? Opening an unlocked door is breaking and entering? No. That it may be trespass, but like I said, I just think it's crazy. And the fact that he's lawyered up, and the lawyer is like saying, no statute in Missouri says this is illegal. What the hell are you thinking? There might be some editorial comment from Lee in there, but I really thought it'd be an interesting thing to talk about for a couple minutes.
Well, I mean, as we established, the HTML code is sent to your browser, and your browser interprets it. So, how could I'm struggling to see like how that could possibly culminate to all this. Like that's.
Would it make a difference if it were compiled code and you were decompiling it? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, that's a lawyer question.
I didn't get the feeling he had to do any decoding or nothing. They were just there in the clear. I mean,
but Jeff's asking the what if. What if you did have to decode it?
Client side, like if it gets trusted and sent to you and you have it on your machine, at that point, and it's public, at that point you better make sure.
We all know the legal principle that possession is 9/10 of the law. So if it's on your machine, and can you do anything you want with it?
Until we start making code NFTs, no.
But you're not. Decrypting it for. I don't know. But you couldn't send it to the person encrypted anyhow. Like, why would you do that in a website? That would make no sense.
It's called HTTPS.
Well, yeah. That's a mutual agreement between client and server. But that's just the transport layer.
There's even a handshake.
Yeah, and even a validation of the public key involved. and all
or
that too.
alleged validation.
Yes, I think alleged validation is highly accurate in this case, Larry. Yes.
Yep.
I don't know.
I mean,
so where did they end up
agreeing,
with
but I
this? Like, has the governor? I didn't follow this story closely because we covered it, last week too. But like, has the governor come around? Like, are there people advising the governor to be like, dude, like, no, you're off your rocker kind of thing? Like, maybe we should bring in some experts to kind of advise you on this.
Sure,
Even
he's doubled, because that's what they do these.
Yeah, they double down. Politicians tend to double down on stuff like that. I mean, did the governor find attorneys that back the governor on this one? Because I think you'd be hard pressed to find an attorney that would like back up the governor on this. Like, if this is going to court, who's going to back up the governor and be like, no, like, viewing the HTML source code is, that's hacking. That's a CFAA violation. That's not going to fly. That's not going to fly.
And if it does,
it's only going to get so far before.
And if it does, imagine the precedent it will set.
There's no way that it would be. There's no way it would set precedent. It would get that far to set precedent.
I mean, it'll set precedent one way or another.
Yeah, exactly.
A viewing source is not a crime, or viewing source is a crime. I mean,
right.
It's going to set precedent one way or the other.
I think we need to.
I think you got to go for the right crime.
Yeah,
I think we need to wait and see how this one kind of pans out, and then get one of our attorney friends of the show to weigh in on it.
Ooh. Oh, I like that.
Right?
Let's do that. Yeah.
Or one of our attorney co-hosts.
Yeah.
Even.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I meant friends in a general sense, whether they're,
Sure.
guests or co-hosts. Yeah.
But
Good
we're very
stuff.
close to.
All right. So we'll let that one play out. While we're on the subject, we mentioned a little bit, Intel has backed or created and backed a new standard called HTTPA, HTTPS attestable. What I garnered from this was Intel's proposing a standard that uses kind of like the TPM technology to protect the data outside of the protocol and tunnel that HTTPS creates. And I've always thought about HTTPS as a transport layer. It's protecting the data in transit. Intel has put forth this new standard to protect it once it comes out of that transit, is how I read this. I don't know if you guys read this one. But
that's your story number 9, HTTPS A?
Intel says, this is my story number 9. So Intel says HTTPS cannot provide security assurances on the request data in compute, so the computing environment remains uncertain risks and vulnerabilities. The community remains uncertain. I don't like their English on this one, but neither here nor there. Like, what they're saying is once it comes out of that, it's up to the compute device to protect that data. Their standard is then put forth to implement other mechanisms to protect that data once it comes out of the transport layer protection that HTTPS gives you.
I haven't read this story, so I'm going to ask the group. So we used to make the joke that you'd put HTTPS on your website, you put SSL TLS on your website, and that's just a secure way to get hacked because you can't see what the transaction is.
Mm-hmm. Well, like, if you're on the server side, you can once it's decrypted.
Right. But now would this kind of prevent that because the payloads that you're sending, there's some authentication and what's the word there? Attestation that the data that you sent is good. I'm wondering what that means. Attestable, as it were.
There's a really lengthy research paper associated with this. That I read the abstract, not the entire paper.
Awesome. I throw it to the other members of the group that may have.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone read this one in any more detail, but it almost sounded to me like the client and server agree not just on the transport layer encryption and security, but they can further protect and validate that data once it comes out of the HTTP protocol or tunnel, if you will. Using, of course, Intel's technologies on the chip to provide that validation.
Of course. I mean, it sounds a little bit like digitally signing the content coming over HTTPS. And it also made me think of the PDF-A format, where that's designed to for archiving. It protects the integrity of the document to the end of the republic, which could be every 4 years. But the point being, it's intended for long-term assurance of the information. Makes sense. I'm just not sure how practical this is. Sounds neat.
I think like most things, it starts out as theoretical and then works its way into being more practical. Again, the article that I linked to does link to the entire white paper that was published by Intel, which I think was interesting enough for me, to kind of flag and go back and read and study in a little more detail. So they're talking about
I'm not hating on the idea by any stretch of the imagination. I think this is really interesting.
So they go on to say, after they kind of like poke at HTTPS, to say a hardware-based trusted execution environment such as Intel's SGX software guard extension provides in-memory encryption to help protect the runtime computation to reduce risk of illegal leaking or modifying of private information.
Yeah. And I think keeping information protected in memory is something that's needed all over. Right?
Yeah,
that's one of
right. Like HTTPS doesn't protect it in memory. To Intel's point, I don't think it was intended to do that, though. Is my point?
No, well, remember, SSL was just a transport option. It was originally just you had HTTP sitting on top of SSL or not. And now it's become pretty ubiquitous, which is really cool. But
can you really the abstract secure anything in memory?
Well, it's a couple.
I don't know,
Tyler. How does SGX work to protect things in memory? Right? It uses. Have you studied SGX more so than I have, and just reading a few articles about it, or no?
He's saying no.
All right, moving along. Next story.
I've been in Russian forums doing a lot of Google translating.
Gotcha.
I did want to talk about Iranian gas stations that were hacked.
Yeah.
And I got one of your stories I want to grab after.
So my story number 13. So according to media reports, the cyber attack 64411 message appeared to customers that tried to purchase subsidized fuel at folks in the U.S. are going to hold on to your shorts. 20 cents a gallon using government issued cards. 20 cents a gallon. It's a lot cheaper than it is here in the U.S. In any case,
that's simple economics.
It is.
Supply and demand.
So a coordinated attack was ensued. Iranian people couldn't get gas because this message appeared, and all of the pumps essentially have been hacked. Also, as news spread, the digital billboards in multiple cities in Iran started to show a message that read, where's our fuel-free Yamaran station, which was interesting that it was a coordinated attack that the gas station pumps were hacked, as well as the digital billboards. So propaganda plus an infrastructure level attack against Iran. Then there's a statement at the end of the article that it's actually pretty funny. Iranian state television confirmed that these were cyber attacks, because there was kind of speculation, was this some other
somebody getting
thing? They said yes, no, this was a cyber attack, and Iran's Supreme Council of Cyberspace. I have to say that. The Supreme Council of Cyberspace believes the incident is state-sponsored, although it's early to say which country is behind it. Anyone want to venture a guess?
Supreme Council of Cyberspace.
Supreme Council of Cyberspace has not came out and stated the obvious that it was Israel.
But why would Israel do that so blatantly? Like, what other operation was going on that they were utilizing that as smoke and mirror cover? Like,
again, Tyler's tinfoil hat is like an entire roll of layers.
Dude,
it's an amazing. It's not a hat. It's a full helmet.
It's not even tinfoil anymore. It's a freaking full-on lead helmet.
Full-on lead helmet.
But
all kinds of shielding.
But he's not wrong.
No.
He's not wrong at all. And that's what I love about it.
I think it's a valid
Mossad was doing... Saratat was in the midst of an operation doing something somewhere.
And they needed a diversion.
Hey, look at that over there.
It is, but I mean, it is out of the play, but it's out of the playbook of Israel. And look, I don't really fault. I mean, if you dig into the history, the geopolitical climate, where Israel is, like, dude, I don't blame him. Like, I really don't. I don't blame him. I think it's actually pretty amazing that Iran just didn't flat out come out and say, like, Israel, can you just knock that shit off? like they didn't even say that. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't blame them. I mean, and I don't even pretend. I know a small fraction of what's happening in that part of the world, and I still don't blame them. I don't.
Yeah, we have a very small perspective. Like, we have a Canada above us. We've got Mexico, and we're yelling about, like, people trying to come to work at a lower wage cost and help us with jobs we don't want to do. Like, we have no understanding of a consistent threat across a not very many mile area of people that literally are just bombing any. Like, you could be under attack at any point. Like, the Iron Dome is
from, like, real. I mean, there's heinous things that happen on the Mexican border. I mean, there's kidnappings and things like that. I don't want to downplay that either, but you put that in the context of Israel, and there's way worse things happening there that they need to be extremely go on the offense, as what we're speculating is happening in this situation. You're right, Tyler?
Yeah.
No, you're not all right? Does it relate to this story, or you're having
your damn story had a link in it that the video started auto playing in the background, had all the auto stuff off, and like.
I'm sorry, I tried to find good sources that don't do that, but it's hard these days. It's hard.
It's probably, and it was probably porno too, so that's even better.
Yeah. Tyler, while I'm looking at it, I did. Did you read my story number 14, Tyler?
Which one was it? Was that the ransomware? The
Azure AD default configuration bug?
Oh, Azure AD. Yeah. I've been reading that one pretty heavily.
Okay, but so hold that thought, Larry. You wanted to pivot, and then I just want to make sure we cover that.
Yeah. No, I was looking at your story number 21 because relevant to my interests.
This one is in your realm of expertise.
Yeah, and I was reading some of the stuff, and I'm like, well. And I think I had this in the show maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago. Not a big deal, but I looked at this and I'm like, wait, I've done some work around this, and in fact, I've tested some devices to see how they handle GPS epoch. Meaning they didn't make the field large enough to handle the date.
They set the. They use GPS to set the date?
Yes.
Correct?
So
right?
GPS is a highly accurate time source.
Okay.
In fact, Stratum 1 is based off of GPS. Stratum 1 NTP servers are based off of GPS.
How does that work briefly?
Or is it Stratum 2?
How do they use GPS to drive?
Satellites.
They receive the GPS signal from satellite, which has a very accurate time clock.
Okay. The GPS satellites have an accurate time clock that's relayed back down to Earth.
And you can calculate how long it takes to get the because of physics, you can calculate how long it takes to get from satellite to us. Very accurate time clock. And it maybe Stratum 1 or Stratum 2 time servers.
Uses that.
Stratum 1 definitely uses local atomic.
Right, an atomic clock.
Yeah, and that's effectively what's on the satellites is an atomic clock.
There's an atomic clock on the satellites.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And I thought about this, and when I originally saw the story, I'm like, holy crap! I tested some of these devices to see what happens when you roll back time or roll forward time to the GPS epoch, and then what time do they think it is? Like, we sent some signals, and it was at the time when an epoch was coming up, and we set it forward to that one, and it handled it. But we set it forward to the next one, totally went back in time, like to the 80s or some ridiculous stuff. Like it was not supposed to do that. So they handled the first one, but they couldn't handle the second one. And arguably the second, and of course I'm like, oh crap, I got to go look at that report again, because like when was that second one? I don't think it was that soon. No, it's like 32 years from now. So arguably in their defense for that device, it was one of those, yeah, if this device is still in the field 32 years from now, you've got bigger problems than the GPS epoch. And I thought that's what this originally was. But no.
This was dealing specific code that was dealing with leap year.
Yep. Leap year and leap seconds.
Yes. Calculations.
Yep.
Which they link right to the source code that tells you what's wrong. And I didn't...
In GitLab, there's an issue reported.
Right. And I didn't pretend to understand every single line of code in here. However, I kind of derived from the code and from the description that it looked like to me there's an accounting for leap year error that... Leap second that like created a time machine triggering a 1024 week backward time jump from Saturday, October 16th, 2021 to Sunday, March 3rd, 2002. It's just a coding error, because
I feel like this is the premise of some show I watch on TV.
Could be, but like coding time and dates, is a huge pain in the ass for a lot of reasons.
Yep.
Like there's math involved, but there's like very specific parameters like leap years you have to take into consideration. There's also many different time and date formats that you have to account for. Like I had to do some of that stuff in Python, and especially when you're dealing with APIs in other systems that may present dates in different formats, you have to convert that to a standard date and time format inside of your code. And there's lots of ways to represent date and time. Sometimes, quite frankly, they're represented as a string, which is a huge pain in the ass, because they want to be represented as a date. And so,
So I love the code. The comments are: assume leap second 19 by December 31st, 2022. So week 2180 is way in the future. Don't allow it. Don't worry about this. It's too far away in the future.
Too far away. It reminds me of the Y2K bug. Right?
If week 2180, then go to week 1024.
It reminds me of Back to the Future. I saw somebody tweeting about this the other day, because aren't all the dates? Was it you, Lee, that posted it?
Well, yeah,
all the dates of Back to the Future have gone way past us.
Yes,
correct.
Red letter date in history. Yeah, October 5th, 1955.
Dave Kennedy's been posting about his.
Yep.
DeLorean. Yeah, I was thinking
that's the day I invented the flux capacitor. I was hanging a picture over my toilet and slipped and hit my head in the porcelain. And when I came to, I drew this.
Flux capacitor.
I've not seen that movie ever.
Great movie. I watched that movie so much as a kid.
Oh my God.
Too. Yeah.
I still do.
I think a lot of us in our generation, that's the one of the movies we watched a lot.
Yep.
So yeah. Tyler, let's jump to story number 14, which is one I kind of I assigned to you. Because I know you love this stuff. We're actually talking about, like, in your LinkedIn or resume or whatever, like you put like what you're good at, and like I was thinking about mine would read like not Windows, like deep Windows shit, like love networking, IoT, Linux, Unix, awesome, Python, but like not a lot of Windows crap. And Tyler, I think you fill some of the Windows crap for us, which is why I assigned to you Azure AD default configuration blunders. Curious
this one is definitely, it's nothing new, and it's nothing that people that attack AD don't know as far as recommendations around security. This is a great article because it kind of covers down some of the defaults that people don't often realize. When you configure Azure AD, a lot of the default roles and how it is actually configured is a little bit different than Active Directory. And so you end up with information similar to Active Directory, where if you get a user account, right, like you can query Active Directory via LDAP and gain knowledge of who the domain admins are, what the domain functional level is. Anything as a low-level user within inside of Active Directory, you can do those kind of queries. Same thing for Azure AD. You get tenant IDs, you get role permissions. You can even create users as a base default user in Azure. as a base user.
Hold on.
So
say that again. As a
default user,
non-privileged default user, you can create other user accounts by default?
Correct. And you can also read. So there's a lot of read permissions, but there's a bunch of things that allow you as a regular user inside of Azure, such as creating apps. Now, on the surface, that's kind of by default. There's a million apps that get created inside of Azure AD as part of kind of how it functions. But the fact that you can create apps and assign certain permissions, you end up with these different roles and permissions that end up getting extended across groups and other roles.
No, wait, Tyler, hold on. I'm just going to stop you right there. Azure AD apps are different or the same from O365 apps?
Azure AD apps are different.
Okay.
Technically. So Azure AD in and of itself is a separate instance, separate tenant from Azure AD. Now there's hooks and ties between all those with your AD account, and whether you're running hybrid and you're syncing across with the AD Connect back down to an on-premise Active Directory, all of those things kind of tie together, but each of those are different. So Azure AD is different than O365 tenancy and what you have up there from a ATP E5 instance that has certain security controls and protocols in there. Now, the accounts may sync back and forth or may not for email accounts and user accounts. But Azure AD is the Active Directory equivalent or maybe tied into your on-prem Active Directory. And so those are all separate. And that causes a big confusion because you have groups in Active Directory. You've got roles inside of Azure AD, and then you have apps that may hook into O365 that also tie to security APIs for something like Sentinel or multiple things. So this gets very difficult to audit and understand what is default and what is not. So this kind of covers a lot of the caveats that you may not understand from a security standpoint and how to better secure your default roles and deployments of your Azure AD tenancies and what's actually exposed.
One of the things I gleaned from that, being a Linux admin is versus a Windows admin, like Windows admins have their work cut out to redefine what the defaults are for security, right? I feel like you've got a lot more work to do I'll use the term Windows admin as the kind of a generic term, whether you're Azure AD or on-premise or Exchange or O365, you got your work cut out in so many different configuration options to kind of reel in the reins on those defaults versus than when you're standing up a Linux or even an AWS kind of Linux based kind of infrastructure. Is that a fair assessment, Tyler?
Yeah, that's probably a fair assessment. There's just so much to how this interplays and interoperates with Microsoft services in general, and then what they've had to connect in and out of these. You start to think about something like Teams or SharePoint, right? Like just simply having O365 or Teams, right? You end up with SharePoint. Well, if you have a Teams meeting and you're not allowing guests, like there has to be a way for authentication to work in order to have these meetings inside of the infrastructure to then allow outside organizations not signed in and make a connection into essentially an Active Directory, so that you end up with things like guests or guest apps. You've got your SAML and OAuth that's happening on the backside of that and how all that kind of interties. So you are a lot more in-depth because of the technology that's being provided across all of the different platforms that interop with these services.
It's crazy. Craziness.
Which is why, again, moving to the cloud, this is one of the things that, this is why our Azure AD assessment tends to do so well, is because no one really has a great grasp on a lot of the security implications because it's so deep, and just understanding the roles and connections between each of these accounts gets very complicated. So this is why there's a big push to have these assessments to understand what the security is, and why moving to the cloud is not always a better idea.
No,
there's a bunch of advantages for something like E5 or O365 where you can offload some of the security for email, but you're also, when you start to talk about doing a hybrid approach or integrating Active Directory, Azure AD, and your on-prem and then O365, there's a lot there to do, and there's a lot of security caveats that you're going to run into if you don't watch out and do this the right way.
Yeah, I feel like there's not
but
like
the
less
sales
stuff.
reps. The sales rep told me that I wouldn't have to worry about security if I just moved everything to the cloud.
Well,
you'll be compliant, right? You'll be PCI compliant if you move to the cloud, because that offloads the responsibility.
PCI compliance aside, I think Jeff brings up a great point in that you might be absolved of some of the operating system level controls that you traditionally had to worry about if everything was on-prem, but you got a whole bunch of other stuff to worry about on how these applications and services in the cloud communicate, the controls and the permissions between them, right? Because even as a Linux user, I can fire up really any browser, log into my Azure AD and O365, and I've got Calendar, I've got Teams, I've got SharePoint, I've got all the Microsoft apps available to me, and that team really has no visibility into the operating system layer on my workstation and no visibility into the operating system layer conceivably in a lot of those apps.
And that doesn't even take into account some of the things like users being able to authorize apps for delegation of permissions, or what an app requests for delegation of permissions and is allowed by default because of default role bases. So getting all that right, not just the administration, which is important because you got conditional access controls that you need to worry about and get right, but you've got users that have the rights to authorize and do certain things. You just look at something like a Google sign-in page, right, for any of the apps that you see out there. Well, O365 and your Azure AD can also allow those sign-ins if you don't restrict that, and so you end up with authorizations for things that you don't want authorizations, or you don't want your users to be able to authorize.
Right. They have locked down a lot of the Power Automate and things like that. Like, because I kind of pushed the envelope there. In Microsoft defaults, when you start enabling like external access to some of those things in Power Automate, and what's the other one? There's the
Power BI, Flow,
and things like that. Like those, they really restrict to internal only. Even Teams, right? Is that by default Teams doesn't allow external guests to connect? So they've done a pretty good job with some default policy.
I think that is the default now.
Yeah.
Easily overridden.
You make that request and someone makes a change, and then.
But at least in theory, it's a deliberate. Yeah, I mean, my point was basically. It's not as cut and dry. You've got some work to do. It's yet another promise of a silver bullet or a holy grail that, in reality might actually take more work, and what every company worries about costs more, especially not to bring up PCI, but if you're logging stuff and you have to retain those logs, so you have to store it somewhere. A lot of my clients, they pull all whatever logs that they have happening in the cloud. Won't say which one specifically. They're pulling it back locally on-prem because it's too expensive.
Yeah, agreed.
That being said, though, like there is a big use case around a lot of the telemetry that Microsoft's able to gather and utilize things like Sentinel in order to correlate a lot of those logs. We see a lot of our clients moving off of Splunk because Splunk is so ridiculously expensive based on the amount of info that you're gathering. And so if you're able to correlate high net value assets with inside the cloud and have a centralized logging that has good telemetry and the ability to do things with things like KQL that have very, very specific and very scalable query languages to identify and respond to incidents, that's when it starts to make a good use case. But again, you have to have the talent and resources that understand, KQL, that understand Azure AD, that understand the Microsoft ecosystem within inside of the cloud in order to adopt that and make that a worthwhile venture. And so I think we have at Security Unlocked, we have I think it's an 1.5-hour workshop kind of dedicated to how to set up threat hunting, incident response in the cloud, how to look at things in Sentinel, and how to kind of run through a lot of the base ground to get up and going with inside the cloud. So you've got good logging, so you have an understanding of what KQL is and how it actually works. I believe Darwin's got a great workshop set up for that. So I would definitely check that out if you're thinking about and trying to look at what this all means from a cloud perspective.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Final thought. You kind of had me when you said you had clients that are actually using Splunk. But go on. Go ahead.
Oh, how the tides shift. I do want to talk about mobile security for a moment. I'm a big Google Pixel fan, and I've been following the Pixel 6 actually for quite some time. I'm really excited about the Google Tensor, which is this article was actually really good. I mean, Google's touting this as a new standard for mobile security. And it's really, I think as security practitioners, it's worth a look and a study of what Google is releasing with the Pixel 6. Even if you might not be a Pixel user, I think it's a great, I encourage folks to look into this. So I've been following these stories. So Google Tensor, a quote from the article, Security Core is custom designed security subsystem dedicated to the preservation of user privacy. It's distinct from the application processor, not only logically, but physically, and consists of a dedicated CPU, ROM, and one-time programmable OTP memory, crypto engine, internal SRAM, and protected DRAM. For the new Pixel line, the Security Core's primary use cases include protecting user data keys at runtime, hardening secure boot, and interfacing with the Titan M2TM, which is the place where they would store things like your biometrics and things of that nature. Lots of new security features on the Pixel 6. They'll do an evaluation of all the apps you have installed and their permissions. They will alert you through the notifications bar when an application is requesting more permissions than they think it needs, in all kinds of really new security things, including some really cool new phones. I'm excited. Tomorrow I'm gonna put in my order for mine when they become available, because I think it's really cool. Again, I'm not an iPhone user. Nothing wrong with iPhones, or that ecosystem obviously has its own security benefits as well. But I think this is really a cool model to study. I've been seeing a lot of articles about it. So
this is like a TPM on steroids for a mobile device with the old hardened phones that we used to look for with like things like BlackBerry and even the black phones that several agencies used.
Hey, Tyler, your dog's home. Or someone just walked in your front door.
Someone's trying to walk somewhere.
How are they making decisions on what they think you should be doing and not doing?
Yeah, and when you have an operating system that can be modified by the mobile operator,
Yeah, well, that's different. So what they're touting here is the specifically security features that will be available on Google branded phones, which is why I really advocate
yes,
if you're going to be in the Android ecosystem,
it's got to be a Google branded device.
You read my story, whatever the number was on here, 7. It really talks about that some of these things are coming up first on Android 12 on Pixel and will be kind of exclusive. Now it's up to the other providers to adopt these features or not, I believe, on other platforms. But the things like the security enhancements, a security hub allows you to manage all your security settings in one place, protect your phone apps, Google account and passwords with a central view of your device's current configuration. So Security Hub will alert you if there's things with your account that you need to secure, a Google account with things from your app security, so applications that might be requesting permissions that they deem harmful. So identify harmful applications and allow you from this one hub to uninstall them. They give you a privacy dashboard, simple and clear timeline view of the apps that have access to your location, microphone, and camera in the last 24 hours.
Can we get
I think it's a huge security step forward.
Can we get that dashboard in a single pane of glass?
It's a single pane of glass, Larry.
And it's right here on your phone, so when you drop it, it's like multiple panes.
Right.
Never mind.
Yeah. So they're storing the your fingerprint in the TPM system to make sure it never leaves the device, which is really cool. I'm excited. Of course, I'm a Pixel user, so.
The other thing I think I read about, I don't know if it was in Android 12 or where, is they're actually changing for apps that you haven't used in a while. It actually takes away the permissions and you have to re-grant them. Which I think is kind of cool.
Yeah,
because over-provisioned is a problem.
Yep, and over provisioned once forever is also a problem.
It is, because you install that weird app so you can control like your Christmas tree or something, and you only use that because I like legit had an app I had to install to control my Christmas tree. And then you use that once a year, right? So revoking those permissions when it's not in use is a great thing.
I also had an app that I had to install to control your Christmas tree.
Yeah. My Christmas tree.
Did it work?
Wait a minute.
Yep. Yes.
Oh, I forgot to write this article up, Larry.
Oh, which one?
70% of Wi-Fi networks cracked by researcher to show their lack of security.
I have that one. It is my story number.
I like how we can add stories.
Number three, cracking Wi-Fi at scale with one simple trick.
Wi-Fi at scale. Okay.
So what was this about, Larry?
So this was quite amazing, and it's honestly it's a wrap up of a bunch of techniques that we teach in 617. So first, it involves doing some sniffing and capturing, not the old school like if I want to do WPA2 pre-shared key cracking, I needed to catch you logging onto the network and get that four-way handshake. It uses the PMK ID, which is in the beacons. Hey, I'm a network, come connect to me. If you're going to connect to me, use this when roaming is supported. So 802.11r. And it's basically an indicator of, hey, when you join this network, you're going to use this key so that when you roam to this other access point, we don't need to spend this time recalculating keys. We already know what it is. Just go. So you can observe when you do the you only need to observe the first step of the authentication, not the beacons. And you can get that PMK ID by saying, hey, I want to join the network. Great, here's a PMK ID. And then just don't ever join the network. So you can get PMK ID with that. And then you can crack the pre-shared key. What this researcher found was he went and walked around Tel Aviv, captured 7,700 networks that had WPA2 pre-shared key, and was able to obtain PMK IDs for 7,700 networks, roughly. With that, he went and did some password cracking. So
the PMK ID inside there is the shared secret, the secret for the network.
Instead of needing to capture the four-way handshake to brute force the pre-shared key, you need one packet that you can get the access point to create for you. Hey, can I join you? Yeah, here you go. Here's some key material.
And was that for roaming?
For roaming. Yeah.
Okay.
And once you have that key material, you can do some brute force math to recover the pre-shared key for that network. So for 7,700 networks that he got PMK IDs for, if roaming's off.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Pre-shared, what'd you say? Pre-shared math? What'd you call that?
Huh?
You mean cryptography?
Yes. Yeah.
Is that what they're calling it these days?
That is.
Yes.
It is.
Math.
So
is he? Isn't he just doing encrypt and compare, or is he actually breaking it?
Breaking it. This is it's a known technique, but he did some really smart things. He thought about how folks create passwords for their pre-shared key network in Tel Aviv. And many folks, and I think it's based on the provider, like the local provider, say, hey, we're going to need to set a password for your network. How about we just use your phone number? And then it's easier for you to remember. So he took Hashcat and did a mask-based attack for the
phone number,
the Tel Aviv country code, the country code for Tel Aviv, and then did numeric brute forcing for the remainder of the number.
So you know some given plain text in every
you know some given plain text, and you know the format for the rest, all digits,
all digits,
and the length.
Yes.
And he recovered 2,200 passwords.
That's cryptography.
That is. He was playing the role. He is, in this case, a crypt analyst. A crypt analyst, Jeff, right?
Then he took rocku.txt and did a word list-based attack against the remaining and recovered another 1,500.
Wow.
So he recovered 3,700 of the 7,700. So it was the math was 70%.
So wait, he too waited in virtual lines to get a RTX 3090 to make this go faster?
No. All done on his laptop.
No.
194,000 keys per second.
Wow.
Yep.
We could make that faster here in the studio because we actually scored an RTX 3090.
Yep. But you start scrolling through the article and all of a sudden it's like a server with all sorts of GPUs in it. And he's like, nope, didn't even need to use that. My laptop worked just fine with CPU.
Well, because he applied the basics of cryptanalysis, Jeff, right?
Yeah, known in plain text.
Yep.
So I have a stupid question, Larry.
Yeah.
Why is he running hashcat as root?
There's a couple of other inconsistencies. You don't need to run hashcat as root. Maybe he was
thinking, no.
Maybe he was on Kali and you're logged in as
It was on
root.
his personal laptop.
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you're not on root when you're logged onto your personal Linux device.
The other one that I noticed that we're a little bit of
note I'm not raising my hand.
The other one that was inconsistent at the very end was that how should I protect myself? Choose a complex password. Yep. Don't use it's home stuff, so PSK. Yep. Don't use the default. Don't use what your vendors. Update your router firmware. Disable weak encryption protocols such as WAP or WAP1. I've never heard of WAP or WAP1.
What's WAP1?
I don't know what WAP is, so I can't even begin to tell you what WAP1 is.
Maybe
WAP,
it's a typo.
WEP and WPA one.
WPA. It's a typo one way or the other.
But it's a double typo. Like it's
double
WAP.
Typo.
Yeah, but it was an editor that probably did that.
What's a WAP? Never mind.
There's a song about
He's
that.
so smart, even I don't know what he's talking
Patty
about.
WAP. Give your dog a bone.
Wait, that's also about that song, right?
Yep.
Knick-knack, paddywhap. Give your dog a bone. Oh boy. Moving
I
along.
love seeing crypto. I love seeing crypto.
Speaking of
practice, though. That's
I agree, Jeff. It's cool. I did have. Speaking of root, PHP FPM. Have any of you guys run PHP FPM?
What?
I can. I'm really. After I read this article, I was like, I'm so glad we just sunsetted the server where I was running PHP FPM because it has a privilege escalation vulnerability. You can read. I mean, the technical details in this article are amazing. What I gleaned from it, and in the synopsis, is the attack basically stemmed from the way that these processes, Apache and Nginx and PHP FPM, and you may run some of these together. In fact, if you're running PHP using Nginx, you're using PHP FPM because it's essentially the PHP like interpreter / app server for PHP code. So you can use like an Apache plugin, or you can use a separate PHP FPM server that serves to basically interpret the PHP code. That's what PHP FPM does. Nginx relies on that exclusively. And in like all three of these cases, and you folks have seen this before with other, I even think SendMail and other mail servers used to work this way. The parent process runs as root. The child processes run as a lower privileged user. And the lower privileged processes that run as children are managed as, I don't know if a queue is the right term for it, but they're run based on the load, right? And you can, as an administrator, configure how many child processes should I run. And the software manages, like, when I receive so many requests, I pass that off to a child process, and it manages the whole kind of processing of those requests through a parent that's running as root, child processes running as a regular user. The vulnerability and associated exploit relied on the fact that child and parent processes share things in memory, such as pointers. And there was actually a multiple vulnerability. Like, to get to the second vulnerability you have to exploit, the first vulnerability is like the child process kind of shares a pointer with the parent process. Then you can kind of dump in the parent process and then exploit something else in the parent process to become root. And I mean, this is why I hate parent processes running as root with children that are running as non-root. I much prefer all of the processes associated with a particular service to run as a non-root user. And actually, some of my examples that I've covered on previous shows and technical segments show you how to do things like run Nginx as not a privileged user, because in fact, it doesn't really need to be root when it runs, especially inside of a container.
The only reason it needed to be an escalated user is to bind to port 80 and 443 because they're
and in a container you can fake that.
Yep,
you can have the container listen.
Ding 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 ding.
Exactly.
Ding ding.
Which I maybe people that are better than Linux than me, which is not saying much, that you could cheat and get around that in Linux, because like if the only reason your process needs to run as root is the fact that it needs to listen on a port less than 1024, like to me that's a bad reason. Like, can't you just make an exception for that and run it as non-root? So but that was the basis of this local root and privilege escalation vulnerability in PHP.
Lee's got a comment here.
Lee.
So isn't it also using the root privilege to switch the effective user ID of the child process away from root to something else? But if you're already not root, who cares?
It's using the child process to get into the memory of the parent process, which is running as root, which is the way
I know that. What I'm saying is that the root you're running as root, you can spawn a process as not root. And so their argument to be running as root is because I want to spawn things as not root.
Right.
Just run the whole thing as not root to begin with and move on.
Agreed, Lee. Agreed.
Again, then you run into the depending on what port binding and maybe
right
and other and it's interesting when you really dig into the Linux internals, like root is kind of like it's a fallacy in Linux. It really is, because there's so many ways to kind of get around the various permissions that you think, oh, like I need to be root, but no, you don't. You need these capabilities, and I can assign a program or binary those capabilities or service those capabilities. I can configure an app armor profile to get around some, like there's so many different ways.
But have you ever tried to convince an admin that they don't need to be running as root?
I think users, Jeff, like actual humans that need to, like services aside, humans that need to log into a system. We had this conversation with Brandon, I can't remember his last name, from Capsulate. He and I were nerding out about this particular point when we were talking about the sudo vulnerability. Like, do I need to have a program that grants me root privileges, or do I just need to become root and get rid of the entire, tens of thousands of lines of code in sudo that like grant me root privileges? Like, why can't I just use su and just become root in that command window to do what I need to do as root, right?
Do you want the answer from a PCI perspective?
Yes.
Because you can log sudo activity, and there's a requirement that all root activity must be logged.
Yeah, but if I believe, and Jeff, hear me out on this one.
Sure.
If I can log that activity without sudo, so I can use something like auditd or Wazoo or a log beat from Elastic that logs every command regardless of a user privilege, do I meet that requirement still, even if I'm not using sudo?
Can you provide attribution with that method?
Yeah, I can attribute it to each user. Like each user on the system entered these commands, and I can log that through a different subsystem other than sudo.
Right.
Well, the other problem with the logging and tracking all activity is, root is rather an anonymous account, but if you're using the sudo, you're hopefully tying it to whatever admin elevated their privileges using sudo.
I can still log that. So I can say a regular user issued the su command and became root and executed those commands and tie it back to a user. Sure.
So yes, given all those caveats, yes, that would be passing. I've had more issues with admins that are like, you're not taking root away from me, MFer, go away. Now, granted, it's been a few years, but I've had too many conversations with admins, whether it's in AD and Windows, they're running as domain admins and checking their email and surfing the web and stuff like that. It's just, there's this old-fashioned principle. Tell me it's still valid, but the root account, the global, the master domain admin account should never be used, and that password should be written down, literally locked in a safe. and in case of emergency, break glass. But everything else that you're doing should be limited access using sudo or run as or something like that.
Speaking of going back in technology, I want to talk about EBCDIC because we talked about it last week. Week. I've got just an amazing story. I love this story so much. So the title was EBCDIC is incompatible with GDPR. And like I saw the title, I'm like, you got to tell me more about this. Like what is the correlation between EBCDIC and GDPR? So there is a bank and there is a customer of this bank, and the customer reported that the bank could not spell the customer's name correctly due to diacritical marks. There's another name for the, tilde over the A, the whole. There's another name for that didn't come to me, but the article references them as diacritical marks, which is also accurate. So the customer, after much frustration, I'd imagine, filed the GDPR complaint under Article 16. If you're curious what Article 16 says about this, it says, and I quote, "The data subject shall have the right to obtain from the controller without undue delay the rectification of inaccurate personal data concerning him or her." That's what it says directly from the GDPR regulations. So like that basically means as a user, I have the right to my data being accurate when you're storing it. And in this case, since there was a diacritical mark in the person's name, that person's data was not being stored accurately. The bank came back and said, we can't do this because the system that we have that is based on a mainframe, they said a U.S. mainframe.
Not based on a mainframe. It's running on a mainframe.
It's running a mainframe from a U.S. manufacturer is all they said.
From like 30 years ago.
And from the 90s. So you got to imagine there's an IBM, most likely an IBM-based mainframe that is only supporting EBCDIC. EBCDIC is a very limited character set and doesn't support the diacritical marks that is in this person's name. And they said it's impossible because EBCDIC, which is just.
So what was the ruling?
I don't think there was a final ruling. They're kind of like
there is a ruling. I had to dig for it. It's not in the article you posted, but the court actually ruled that the citizen has the right to have his name spelled correctly. So
unfuck it.
Yeah. So fix it, bank. Now I haven't found what the bank's going to do about it.
Yeah. Like, what do you do? So EBCDIC, which is interesting, extended binary coded decimal interchange code is what it stands for. Developed in 1963 to 1964 by IBM for their mainframes and AS400 computers.
Correct.
Which are still very much in, as we established last week, are still very much in use today. I don't know that, do they have updates to those particular operating systems that can support ASCII or UTF-8 or any of the more modern kind of standards?
I think the answer is yes, but it did. Yeah. I did have flashbacks of trying to get printers to work back in the Unix days and the mainframe days, and having to learn about PostScript and all sorts of other weird stuff. And I'd rather not relive those days.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty interesting story.
It was fun. It was just fun to see EBCDIC in an article.
Agreed.
And NPM packages or ransomware or mining.
Oh, so the NPM thing, I loved the command.
Yeah,
like in the JavaScript, they're executing cert util and downloading an executable to the user's workstation, which is malware. And I'm like, so the link
and mining.
Yeah, and mining. But like the link is like this huge GitHub like thread of people going, yeah, like I'm implementing this library and I got this malware on my computer. Like just like one user, like multiple users of UA parser JS. I mean, so much so that they're members of our team that talked to our developer members of our team that were like, we're not using this library, right? Like, please make sure we're not using this library. But I think this is also, since it was Windows malware, more likely targeting JavaScript applications running locally, like Electron apps running locally on the user's workstation.
I think I had this same story, and I remember when I was reading about it, the developer's source code repository got hacked. His account got taken, and I'm like, why the hell aren't you securing your source code access?
I mean, and GitHub has made strides to protect those source code repositories. I mean, you can't log as of August 2021, right? You can't log in with a username and password. You gotta have a token based authentication. I mean, they've really been making strides to lock that stuff down. I mean, they've had two-factor in there for a long time, and the call goes out to folks that are maintaining even semi-popular, let alone extremely popular open source GitHub repositories to protect your accounts, to use that two-factor and lock things down. But again, it goes back to our AD conversation, to really a lot of our conversations about configuration. Make sure that stuff is configured properly. Just because you're not hosting your own GitHub or SVN instance, there's still configuration you have to apply to make sure things are secure.
I thought it was pretty funny. It did install for Linux as well, by the way. It had a Linux variance for it in the preinstall.sh.
Nice.
But it also checked for RU, UA, BY. It checked for a few countries from free geo, to make sure that they were not within that country, otherwise it quit. So false attribution, false flag exercise, I don't know. Like maybe keeping the government off their ass. But there's some interesting stuff in there between the Monero mining and the keylogger and credential stealer that it dropped. Some interesting tradecraft that got, we've been talking about packages being a huge vector that I think we're going to see more of, like keeping a review eye on what packages you're installing, what libraries get installed as part of packages, and then how do you secure that full chain down from the library to the package to the distro to the the update. That's right. A big problem and concern that we're going to have to deal with in the future.
And Tyler, I'm a huge proponent of putting guardrails and limits on packages that are, or add-ons or packages that you're using, putting guardrails on that so they can't do things like download a file from the internet, so they can't do things like access files they're not supposed to. You're including these libraries and add-ons for a specific purpose.
Unless they're logged on as root, by the way.
True, but you should have the ability to put some guardrails on there, and I think the malicious Firefox add-ons is one such case. Flipping over to the browser, there was a malicious Firefox add-on that blocked your browser from downloading security updates. Like, why should an add-on have the ability to affect the main program's ability to download updates? So they essentially configured a proxy server and used some like whitelisting, blacklisting kind of things to say you can't contact.
Is that a rhetorical question?
It's now called an allow list and a deny list.
Yes, thank you, Larry.
Is that rhetorical, or do you want the answer?
No, I do want an answer.
Because somebody was having a problem and that made it work.
Yep.
Well, I think it's that usability versus security is what you're talking about, Jeff, right?
Something like that.
Because there are use cases where a library that I import into my React app should have permissions to do things, and if I restrict those permissions, that's not going to work and halt production. Same thing in your browser. There could be things where a legitimate add-on needs to do something in terms of restricting traffic or interacting with the proxy, but there's also malicious use cases as well. How do we differentiate between the two? I mean, this is, people thought the S-bomb is the answer, and that's great to know what you have, but Josh Marpet would be jumping up out of his seat during this conversation. But
yes.
To me, that only solves part of the problem. Like we have to be able to apply proper controls to these add-ons or libraries when we're incorporating that into our code or other.
So does that fall under security, or does that fall under the developers and the CDIC pipeline and the unit testing that happens as part of that?
Yeah, I feel like mature organizations with more resources are better equipped to deal with this issue, Tyler. Having that really sound and robust CI/CD pipeline set you up for success in that I can go developer request that they want an add-on in this code, and it goes through a rigorous testing process before it ends up in production. Not everyone's at that level.
I would even say like large organizations though are not equipped to handle this. Call it
I'd say most organizations
20-person security team where they're trying to deal with incidents, deal with pen tests, deal with security requests, respond and architect secure environments. Even those, like, they're not coders, they're not developers. Like, how do you fit this into a risk threat profile model that makes sense outside of, very explicit AI and ML, like I hate to say it, code reviews that do the dynamic analysis prior to code push. Like, static analysis only goes so far because it doesn't scale. There's not enough people that understand the attacks and understand the code and have the time to look at it with inside of an org that has the capability to employ someone like that.
And also, advanced defensive techniques that are looking at these libraries that you're importing and looking at how you're using them. Even that's a hard problem to solve. One of my gripes as a developer was GitHub would say, hey, you're using a library and it has vulnerabilities. And I'm like, that's great. Let me dig into that. And then I'm like, all right, I'm incorporating that library, but like I'm never calling the method that you're saying is vulnerable in my code. I'm calling other methods which aren't vulnerable, but I'm not calling the method in that library, in that object that I'm importing that's vulnerable. But I'm calling the non-vulnerable one. I mean, I could eventually.
Now GitHub could dig deeper to figure that out.
But that's hard. That's a really hard. And I've talked to people that make this software, Larry. It's a very hard engineering problem to solve.
And how much of that is on GitHub's and how much of that is on you as the developer?
Right? No, fair.
Yeah.
It's not an easy problem to solve.
No. Hey, speaking of not an easy problem to solve, Paul, my story number 5, the title doesn't do it a lot of justice, the copyleft compliance projects. This is a story that the Software Freedom Conservancy is filing a lawsuit against Vizio, the TV manufacturer and other stuff.
Oh, okay. Not the Microsoft Flowchart.
Nope. Vizio, for what it calls, and I'm reading from the article here, repeated failures to fulfill even the basic requirements of the GPL. The lawsuit alleges that Vizio's TV products built on its SmartCast system contain software that Vizio unfairly appropriated from a community of developers who intended consumers to have very specific rights to modify, improve, share, and reinstall modified versions of the software. Can you say Linksys?
Yeah, all over again. Yep.
On how many Vizio TVs? Like, I would totally run Open Vizio on my TV.
Yeah, the TV stuff is really it's heinous.
And
is it Vizio that I don't know what I bought TVs for 2 of my kids. It's a really crappy implementation of Android.
It's probably Vizio.
And it might be Vizio.
Yeah.
Or high scene or whatever it is.
Oh no, there's the other one that you can like get a massive decently LCD screen at like BJ's or Costco that like has no ability to tune into TV. It's like all based on their app stuff, and they're super cheap type of stuff. Like when a couple years ago when we bought TVs,
TCL.
TCL. That's the one.
That might be the one I have.
Yeah.
TCL is the Roku stuff.
Yeah, it's
so they're upgraded versions of Roku.
And they're hella cheap.
Non-upgraded version is the app version that runs the stupid Android shit.
I think that's the ones I have on sale at Best Buy last year, like Black Friday kind of deal, and they run a really crappy Android. It only supports 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi. The Android on it is really slow. Like it works. I got to keep on top of the settings and stuff like that. But it's bad.
But then again, the TV was cheap for your kids' room.
Exactly. I didn't need to add another device to have the smart TV functionality. And I monitor it very closely.
I will say that we have the LG and it has the built-in stuff, and the LG stuff is actually fairly decent, and we've got all the apps, and I love the smart TV. And
Samsung has the Tizen stuff, which is pretty vulnerable as well.
Yeah,
I think it's a Linux-based.
I haven't seen the stuff about the LG, but I'm sure it's just as vulnerable.
Yeah, but the TV stuff is bad. It's bad. It's very hackable.
the updates on the TV stuff is scary. Like
if you
at some point, that's going to be a big deal.
Because I feel like they produce these really cheap TVs. They roll together like the firmware. They put the minimum amount of effort into that firmware and that system. They release like very
it's wireless routers all over again, right?
Yeah,
like,
it's very sparse updates.
You're expecting
if you get
a 2-year lifespan,
right, and then they're done, and then they're on to the next cheaper model where they're developing even whatever different firmware, and they're not maintaining the old because that's a cost to them. Yeah, I agree. It's bad. It's a bad situation.
I will say I'm happy with my LG for exactly the opposite of those reasons, because we get lots of updates. Like it seems like every time I go to open an app, there's an update for it. Because the apps are maintained by a third party. Yeah. And we get notifications when there's an app update for the TV. Like I turn it on first thing in the morning, like, hey, we need to update your TV. Would you like to do that now? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
All the time.
Is that coming from the iPad or from the internet?
I don't know. Like in hindsight, I'd really like a TV that's really just a monitor. And I want to go then choose what device plugs into that HDMI that gives me the ability to use my entertainment system. Well, and like maybe that choice is NVIDIA, because I think NVIDIA does a really good job of keeping up with their devices. If NVIDIA would
build something internally that's integrated, I would 100% buy it. Like Roku's doing a pretty good job, honestly. If I had to pick one, it's Roku.
I mean, but Roku's really proprietary, which almost makes me have even more hesitation because they're so proprietary. And I think when things get really proprietary like that, like no one's lifting up the covers on it. Like
it comes down to like, how do you segment this in your network anyway? Like thinking about that, like I tried guest isolation. That's a horrible fail. That does not work. Remotes don't work. App streaming doesn't work. Kids trying to send things to it doesn't work. Like, So how do you actually secure the things that you don't trust in your network that still need functionality? This is what we went back to, Paul. Like, how do you design a home network that still works for your family?
But have it be maintainable, because I mean, we could all build a Raspberry Pi that gives you probably pretty similar functionality, but then the onus is on the user to keep that shit up to date, to have a Raspberry Pi, let's say, or some other embedded computing device.
Or BeagleBone Black.
So you're going to run Kodi on that, but the support for all the apps isn't quite there.
And then you're rooting or jailbreaking something to run Kodi.
Right. Or you're rolling your own Android device. Like, it's a lot of work to get a really reliable device. You can do it. It'd probably be more secure, but you've got a lot of work.
It is not yet the year of Linux on your TV.
No. I mean,
but I think maybe this is getting there.
Linux is on your TV, but either it's something you got to put a lot of work into, or you got to trust whatever's coming from the provider that they're not keeping up to date. We
need zero trust for our TVs.
I mean, I have zero trust in my TV already.
Yeah, you just don't configure the Wi-Fi or the network on it, right? And use some other device.
But then it's not usable.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, even if you do build your own crap, you end up with the problem of like a usable remote for your kids or your wife, right? Like all of the apps you need and something that functions as intended for most users to use.
But then,
and then you got to support it.
Trying to navigate HDMI and all the nuances that are associated with it is a complete nightmare. Like sound and video and network and how it all intertwines. Like, I've ripped stuff out of my home entertainment stuff and put new stuff in just so it can be more usable. Because when we're sitting here doing a podcast, there's people at home, quite frankly, that are trying to watch. All they want to do is watch TV, right? So, I mean, some of the solution is you just give them an Xbox and let them run off the X. Quite frankly, that might be the most secure and most usable solution, is just throw an Xbox in every single one of your TVs and be like, look, this is where you play games and this is where you watch TV.
Yep.
Can you get YouTube TV on an Xbox?
I don't know.
You can.
Yeah. There you go.
Beautiful. I think YouTube...
PlayStation as well. In fact, you can get live TV on PlayStation. PlayStation Now has had that for quite a while. Like, I don't personally know because I don't own a gaming system, but that's what most users use, is that PlayStation Now, that Sony network integration.
Right. The problem with that, though, is when you want to watch TV, but your kids want to play video games, now you need multiple... It gets expensive
plus cost,
real fast.
Like getting even the latest like PS4, whatever the latest thing is, like end up in lines. Like, people use these for gaming, so there's supply and demand issues and cost to associate with it.
Yeah, Larry, I want your story number 4 on this topic as well. Oh, see, I was going to say I got a PS5 for my oldest daughter a couple weeks ago. Best trade I ever made.
Unlocking an Oculus Go.
Yeah. Hey, before we do that one real quick, just as a little bit of lip service, my story number 1, the mycelium to your mesh network. Check that one out. It's the ability for us to do messaging over non-SMS type networks for like freedom and so forth, for quote freedom, and it's not fully baked yet. So go check it out and see what you can do for freedom. But the unlocking the Oculus Go was interesting, and it's looking like the article is completely missing now. But it is effective.
That happens.
It is effectively the ability for you to take the older Oculus Go and without the need to do any hackery, supported from Oculus, specifically a blog post from John Carmack to say, hey, here's a free, an unlocked operating system for you to install on this device, which you can't go back from, and have fun using it.
That's interesting because that Oculus
is it only on the Go?
It's only on the Go.
What is the Go? The Go is different from the Quest?
Yeah, the Go is the original first generation.
The original. Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was the, they had the first immersive was like you put the phone in the thing, and then the next generation was Oculus Go.
Okay.
And then you start moving into the Quest.
The Quest is the fully separate kind of system that you can connect as a display device to your PC.
Yes.
And then the Quest 2 is the better version of that you have, Paul.
Right.
And there's another one in there too that all the rendering is done. Is that the Go? All the rendering is done on like a PC with a GPU and feeds it over USB-C.
Yeah, that's the Rift, I thought.
Oh, that's the Rift. No, you're right. That's the Rift.
Yeah.
Okay. I have the Go, and we not the Go. We have the what's the next one?
I have the Quest 2.
I have the Quest. I don't have the Quest 2.
Gotcha.
And we love the Quest. We haven't played it in a little bit. And
I feel like you go through fits and starts with that. Anyway,
and we have issues with it charging. And like I've had to replace the charger and the cables, and still issues with it. It's weird. Like it'll literally stay on the charger in the box for a month, and you go to pull it out, and it's like not charged. So. Weirdness.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of potential in VR and AR that's just not being tapped because it's a little bit of a barrier of entry, and it takes a little bit of understanding to kind of understand all the nuances between them. But I'm still surprised it hasn't taken off more than it has, even just as a display or alternate display for most people. Like I use mine as a very large monitor oftentimes for my desktop.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I'd love to do more of that, and Tyler, maybe we should sync up on how that happens. But
I have, I think, 3 stories I want to cover that are loosely and somewhat not related to cybersecurity.
I think we've all got a bunch of stories like that.
So let's go with Bitcoin mining power plant raises ire of environmentalists. So, quote the article, I thought this was really interesting. Greenidge Generation runs a once mothballed plant near the shore of Seneca Lake in the Finger Lakes region to produce about 44 megawatts to run 15,300 computer servers, which is really funny. Plus additional electricity it sends back to the state's power grid, which I also thought was interesting. So like it seems to me that a large corporation or like a large company, I mean, they must have had a lot of capital to buy a power plant that had been a coal-fired power plant that had been decommissioned.
A power plant in a highly regulated industry.
Yeah. So they're going, look, we're going to buy this power plant and it's coal-fired and we're going to run it. And that power plant produces about 44 megawatts of electricity, which is enough to power about 15,000 computers in a mining farm or 35,000 homes, but we're going to use it to power it. So I don't know what the exact math works out to, but they're using it to power 15,000 computers. They've got enough power left over to send some back to the grid, which to me kind of speaks of we're kind of greasing the wheels. Like we worked with the regulators and the laws in environmental to be like, look, we're going to buy this power plant. We're going to give you guys some power because we know you need power here in the U.S., but we're going to use the rest of our power to mine cryptocurrency It's a thing, and we're going to buy all the coal and the people to run this plant, which it has to cost them a massive amount of money to run this plant. I don't know if the grid paying them for the power they're sending back. They must be. They must be. So they're recouping some of the cost by selling the power back to the grid. Tyler, this is some of the stuff you were talking about off air last week. I think this is an amazing play, but to pull this off, there's a lot of moving parts.
A lot of moving parts doesn't even cover it. So you have a few things there. You've got, they're sending some power back to the grid, pennies on the dollar, and kind of greasing the wheels a little bit. There's not much coming back. Every bit of crypto mining space and colo in the U.S. is pretty well spoken for, taken up, and with inside of contract right now. The exfil from China and China shutting down most of the crypto and the Russian governments taking over crypto sites has forced a good portion of the crypto miners in the game to move to the U.S. There's only so many sites that can power these colos. So for roughly every 280 S19 Pro J amp miners, you're looking at 1 megawatt of power necessary.
Now, hold on. A megawatt is 1,000,000 watts.
Correct.
What is that?
280 miners equals 1 megawatt.
Okay, so what is that? So I've got 200 amps coming to my house. What is that? What is that in amps?
So you're probably running a 200 amp.
Like most homes are 200 amps.
Regular home installation. That's not even, so an 800 amp is going to be what like an apartment building is going to run. Roughly 1,000 to 1,200 amp is necessary for a half a megawatt. Sometimes you can get away with a 2,400 transformer that is, you're pulling in 2,400 amps for roughly 1 megawatt for a colo for about 280 miners.
That's like a significant amount of power. So and that power's got to come from somewhere. In this case, it's coal, like they're feeding like a coal-fired engine in a train, right? Like that's a lot of, you got to burn you got to fuel to create that much power.
You got to have some carbon emissions and some carbon offsets.
Yeah.
It's a ton of power. When you're talking about mining, though, you're talking about like they're using ASCII miners, probably amp miners. You're talking about something like an S19. You're talking about 1,000 terahashes a second. These are specifically designed for mining.
So these are not like, I'm not building PCs with graphics cards. This is specialized computing hardware for mining.
100%. Everything. If you're doing real mining with inside of the industry in bit mining, you are doing it on an ASCII miner. Now these are like
is that like an FPGA?
Kind of. So it's on-chip specific miners that have the mining capability built onto the chip, and it's a single chip board that has a manager with just a NIC and a very, very low OS.
So it's like a single purpose chip that does one set of math really well.
I got you.
So think
it's an IoT device for mining.
So think about this.
Yes.
WEP.
Yep.
Had a chip that could do RC4 really well.
Yeah.
So when WEP was broken and you went to move to something else,
new chip.
And you needed a new chip, but everybody had these millions of things in the field, so it needed to be software updatable, which is why WPA is based on RC4.
WPA 2 use the same hardware.
WPA 2, 5 years later, AES,
different chip,
new hardware.
Yep.
Yeah, very, very specific hardware. So they take a ton of power. Very, very. It's a very small market. Honestly, there's not that many players doing this at scale, and all those that are doing it have agreements with power grids where they're taking over sites of repurposed, say like sawmills. They needed a 35 megawatt sawmill factory. So all of these sites have been bought up around the U.S. Now the U.S. has an interesting position on this because technically, within the U.S., everything in the power industry is renewable outside of coal. So hydro, solar, nuke, all of those are renewable energies in the grand consortium of international power. And we've been doing that for a very long time. That's not technically what the U.S. would consider renewable. We'd think that as like solar or something geothermal, right? But everybody coming in sees geothermal or nuke, which Georgia is 100% nuclear now, or by January they will be. So all this renewable energy, they can sign off, these Bitcoin miners and companies can sign off on, we're doing renewable energy mining, and have that as one of their ability to do business in the U.S. or to make contracts or as a PR, whatever they're going to do.
Right. Crazy.
Crazy.
Amazing.
Some more salad shooter squirrel
Let's
stories.
Do it.
Cosmic microwave background.
Oh, I love this story. And I love this story because
we talked about this off air last week.
We did, and I wanted to cover it in more detail this week because I think it's funny that I was helping my son with his science homework. And as most of us nerds, I think we get excited about helping our children with their science homework because most of us love science. I mean, if you're in, computer security, I mean, you likely have this affinity towards the math and the science. You're kind of like math, and maybe not math, but certainly science. People, sure, right? And so so I linked to the video. I actually found the video that my son's teacher had assigned him. It's a 5-minute video on YouTube. It's Neil deGrasse Tyson narrating this video on how Bell Labs physicists Arno Penzias and Robert Woodrow Wilson, by the way, that was his name, set out to map radio signals from the Milky Way. The way I understand the story and the way the video presents it is that AT&T was researching satellite communications. It seemed to me like the first kind of satellite phones is what they were researching. And you think about the history of AT&T, how they were broken up into the different bells. One of the things that AT&T retained as part of the AT&T primary company is Bell Labs, is the research arm. And Unix and a lot of other things came out of Bell Labs. And so in Bell Labs, they're researching satellite technology for communications. They observed that there was this interference in satellite communications, and they didn't know where it was coming from. So they kind of charged these two physicists, Penzias and Wilson, to determine where this interference was coming from. Yep. And they commissioned them this really big antenna. And the story kind of talks about a little bit of the history of this really large antenna. And so the first thing that these two scientists did was point this antenna in just this innocuous, just point it into space. Like we would do is kind of like in our tests, right? Like if there's interference, let me just point it into a point in space where there should be no interference and just see what we get. And they still got this interference. And they were like, being scientists, they're like, okay, what's our hypothesis as to where this interference is coming from? They observed, as most good hypothesis, you go to your observations. There's bird poop from, I think it was pigeons, that's inside the antenna. And it's really funny to watch this video because they kind of gloss over it. But Penzias and Wilson said, as grad students, we did other more horrible things. Then what they were referring to was cleaning the bird poop out of the antenna. So they physically had to climb inside the antenna and clean this bird poop to eliminate it as a potential variable that it was causing this interference. So they cleaned the bird poop. They got the antenna pointed in space, and they're like, we're still getting this microwave radiation interference. And they're like, where could that come from? It turns out that the theories of the Big Bang, that the universe was once this one central mass that basically exploded and created the universe. The result of that was that there are still to this day microwave radiation interference in the universe, in space. And that's what they were receiving. They kind of corroborated their story with another university that was 40 miles away. This was in New Jersey, where they had the antenna. And they were like, hey, we're studying the effects of the Big Bang and trying to prove the Big Bang. And they're like, hey, when we point our big antenna into space, we're observing microwave radiation that we believe is causing interference. They end up winning the Nobel Prize. because it turns out that it is in fact in the universe there is microwave radiation that can cause interference that is still to this day a result of the Big Bang.
Yes.
Which I thought, so a lot of interesting things that at the end of the YouTube video, which is awesome, you should go watch it. Neil deGrasse Tyson has those old folks, we all remember, we had the TV with the rabbit ear antennas, and if you tune to a station that, in between stations, you get the static, right?
Yep. That's how encrypted traffic should sound like.
Right. 1% of that is microwave radiation interference as a result of the Big Bang, which I think was just really cool. Residual Big Bang microwave radiation.
Cool.
I thought that was a really cool kind of salad shooter kind of story.
On a less technical note, my squirrel story for the week, and where's the lower third, guys? Are you asleep in the back room?
Yeah, where's the lower third? Also, I thought my son's teacher asked a really good question as part of his homework.
Yeah.
She asked, she said, given what you've learned about the Big Bang, do you believe that there could be other things from the Big Bang that you could measure and observe?
Ooh.
And, I asked my son, I'm like, so if you found microwave radiation, is it conceivable that you could measure other radiation or other artifacts in the universe that could be a result of the Big Bang? He's like, yeah, but probably there's other stuff out there, right? And I thought that was a really good kind of, we talked about troubleshooting.
Yeah, like the restaurant at the edge of the universe.
Yeah.
You put a hook on it and it just keeps going, right?
Right. So I thought it was really cool. Really, really good. I tend to pick on some of the educational institution, things here in the U.S., but I thought that was a really good lesson.
Yep. So mine was a California town smells like rotten eggs, vomit, farts, and bodily odor. And I'm
more science.
I'm like, this could be the studio, or Paul. It could be our teenager's room.
It could be totally our teenager's room.
Yeah,
right?
Hopefully minus the vomit, but we all know that they've been sick and probably vomited on the carpet, and that's still there. It turns out that it is in fact the decaying of marine life that hasn't been recycled through some water.
It was something like in waterways due to a drought. There wasn't
it wasn't
the red water thing.
Yeah, kind of deal.
Reminded me of swamp gas, UFOs and swamp gas and stuff.
But this reminded me of us in that, so many years ago we said, I love this industry because we can talk about vomit, burp, and snort and not be talking about a bodily function.
And security conferences sometimes smell the same way, quite honestly.
Yeah. As does my teenager's room.
Might
even argue that my 8-year-old's room smells very much the same.
Yes.
Oh, boy.
If you live in a house with 3 boys like I do, their bathroom smells the same way.
Oh God,
they can't.
Dude,
targeting is tough. They're like stormtroopers trying to hit a target.
Dude, I have 3 women in my house, and the 2 younger women, the 2 girls, they have this habit of closing the bathroom door and putting a sign on it that says out of order. I'm like, no, that's not the correct answer. Go plunge the damn thing. The plunger is right next to the toilet, and you both know how to use it.
But can you imagine living in this town and just smelling this heinous smell and people got sick from it?
Yeah,
as well, which is just
headaches, nausea, and other ailments.
Oh, just awful.
Yep. Don't go into your kids' rooms.
Nope.
Teenage funk. Smells like teen spirit.
Yes.
All right.
Very much so. Do we have other articles, or was that?
I think that's it. I think
we're done.
Tap out.
Woo! Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching this edition of Paul's Security Weekly. Larry, take us out.
Over and farts.